And I want to record. We are recording, everybody. So if you don't want to be recorded, please change your name to something like Anonymous1 and turn off your camera. Otherwise, you're going to be part of the record. So wait one more minute to get everybody here. But thanks to everybody for being here. If you could tell in the chat, where's everybody from? Oh, you already asked that question. You're good. You portrayed well. So we've got one from the US, it looks like, and we got a good range of Canadian territory covered today. Oh, you don't have the ability to change your names. Thanks for letting me know, Basha. Okie dokie. I think we had a contingent from Lakehead, Angela. I don't know what you did, but you did a good job of promoting. And they'll take up the center of the country, which is great. Wait one more minute and then we'll get started.
Not that I'm pushy or anything.
We got somebody from California joining us. Clark is here. So we have at least 4 time zones. Do we have anybody here from the East? I didn't see anybody from the East, but I could have scrolled past you.
Yeah, we got Halifax.
Oh, we do have Halifax. So we have 5 time zones. That's pretty cool. Now someone would just come from Newfoundland. We get 6 time zones.
Well, we got more than that because I see somebody from Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, how'd that happen? That's kind of cool. Thanks.
I think that was through Rana. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know. Wow. Okay.
I know.
This is quite the international presentation. This is cool. All right, I'm going to get started because I want to make sure we have as much time as possible with our guest speaker. But first, I want to introduce myself. I'm Saul Carliner. I am the president of the Canadian Network for Innovation in Education. And on behalf of my colleagues on the board, many of whom are here today, I am delighted to welcome you all. I need to clear my throat. And before I introduce the speaker, I just want to tell you about a couple things that we have coming up. Our annual conference is scheduled for the 2nd through the 4th of May. It will be held right here in a Zoom room, different Zoom room, but a Zoom room. But it's going to be an engaging experience. We have speed networking coming. We've got birds of a feather sessions coming. And even more, we have some really cool keynote speakers. I have 2 that I'm ready to announce publicly. First one is David Wiley, who is, the founder of or popularizer, at least, of originally the concept of open learning objects, and more recently, open educational resources. He's been very active in that movement. And he's also the president of the Association for Educational Communications and Technology, a group that definitely Johannes is very active in. And some of the other people here are, and that's our partner organization in the US. We actually have, I don't know if anybody knows it, but we have a relationship with them. So we're super delighted about that. Also super delighted to announce, and this will be a name known to many Montrealers, Elizabeth or Liz Charles, who is the founder of Saltese, which is probably one of the most extensive learning communities about teaching and learning in higher ed, with a special focus on college, or as we call them in Quebec, cégep teaching, is going to be talking to us. And she's got a fascination with effective and engaged teaching, as well as a wealth of experience in how you make a learning community really work, last, and get funding for it. So I'm really excited about those events. You missed the awards deadlines, but Carol's going to have some announcements in about probably 6 to 8 weeks with who won. Cindy's going to have some from the Amtech Trust Awards, which is a slightly different competition. It's a different kind of competition. It's a grant competition. And we will have all kinds of notifications going out to people. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. A little bit of background about Johannes. Johannes and I met when, and I might add, Angela met him at the same time, when Johannes was actually started his academic career as a professor at Concordia University in Montreal. So he's got a relationship with the country. I think Rana may have met him then too. And he's always been a friend, even though he left us and went to another country. He's been to a number of different schools. He has expertise not only in ed tech, but also in engineering education, but he's a philosopher at heart. And so we found a way to kind of put them all together. Actually, Johannes did. He suggested 3 presentations, and 2 of them I said, those 2 look really good. Could you do something together? He said, yeah, I can do that. So that's how we got him. Johannes was left a full professor position to go work as a director with SRI, which is the Stanford Research Institute, as I remember the name. And it's that Stanford, in case you're wondering, the one in Palo Alto, near the amazing Palo Alto Mall. But most people are concerned about the research, not the quality of shopping. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Johannes to talk to us about troublemakers.
Well, thanks, Saul, and thanks for all the introduction and for the invite to speak here. It's truly an honor. It's, as Saul said, yeah, I started my academic career, and let me switch to my slide set. But I started my academic career as a humanities major, and then shifted into learning technologies and ended up somewhere in engineering and STEM education. And that's certainly a context area I'm drawing from. Can everybody see the presentation screen? All right, great. Well, as the title says, insight from unusual perspectives, I'm trying to look here at what are voices and perspectives that we might not necessarily have always in the education enterprise. And I want to start with an unusual question. I want to say, when is it okay to throw eggs? It's an interesting question because we could think of many different places where we actually think it's a pretty good expression, a political expression of throwing eggs at politicians. I want to show you 2 small videos. The videos will probably not show full screen, but it's for the point of them. They don't really have to show full screen. But let me actually stop sharing for a moment so my sound comes over to the where is it? Oops, can't stop sharing. Here we go. Let me share again, but this time turn on my share sound. All right, I think we're back in business. So I call that the 2 tails of eggs. So
what on earth possessed you to do this? Leo, my God, you did 24 eggs all over my living room.
Excuse me, I'm seeing your...
Why did you do this?
We're not seeing the video.
You're not seeing the video?
I'm seeing an Outlook screen, a email screen.
Oh, sorry. That's not a good idea. I might have shared my desktop instead. Let's try that again. It's not like we're using, it's not like we're using Zoom for a couple of years now. All right. Can you see the screen with the videos? Okay, let me just start. It's just 30 seconds. Oops. Okay, here we go. Let me start. Yeah?
What on earth possessed you to do this? Leo, my God, you did 24 eggs all over my living room. Why did you do this? What?
So this is tale number one. This is an egg story. You find it actually on YouTube. I cut out actually several pieces out of it because in the beginning, his mother presumably uses quite the expletives. So it's actually much stronger, and I couldn't stomach actually listening that mom berating her kid. What comes a little bit later is that actually the little Leo didn't trust that every egg has something yellow in it. So he was just throwing because, you know, maybe he finds one where there is no yellow in it. Let's look at the second video.
Hey, it's springtime, and here in the BYU Splash Lab, we thought it'd be a great idea to spin some eggs, break some eggs, and maybe even laser a marshmallow peep. I'm Professor Tad Truscott in the BYU College of Engineering, and here today we have some of the tools we use to study fluid dynamics. Spheres, tanks of water, lasers, and high-speed cameras. We love the Photron camera, and this one can shoot up to 1,000,000 frames per second. Check this out. So this thing like spread out, and it flattened the egg. And now the egg is like, the eggshell, the eggshell.
yeah.
Now the eggshell is coming back and going,
This is just one clip from a lab at BYU University. So let me ask again the question, when is it okay to throw eggs? Because on the one hand, what Leo does is actually the exact same thing that the BYU lab does, just more sophisticated, maybe the BYU lab. But Leo has a theory, and he's testing, and and he's using what is available to him. And the other person got a couple $1 million to buy equipment to do exactly the same thing. Question is now, how does the BYU prof become what he is? And when we look at the first video, we might think at first, right, this is a waste of eggs, which it is, right? I mean, there's 24 eggs laying on the floor, and they cost money, and they need to be cleaned, and all of that. On the other hand, Leo learned here, and what happens if we classify him as a troublemaker? Because that's probably what he is on some level. And we might stop him from learning, from experimenting, from doing science projects. So I want to go into, when you look at the news, there's tons of language that are not just using the word troublemaker, but I could have pulled up a ton of different headlines that talk about disruptive students, like this letter to an editor, deal with troublemakers to keep schools safe. There's an article about a new research study of why men are becoming minority in college campuses, and they relate that to boys are called troublemakers, and that makes them disengage. Here's a Dayton, Ohio comedian who says, my principal was the only one who actually saw me as a troublemaker and actually helped me. I was a troublemaker. We know from research, at least in the United States and from Germany, that's the two research contexts I know, we know that students with immigrant backgrounds and students of color are more being labeled troublemakers than anybody else. And usually they're also getting more punished. So expulsion rates, sending to the principal, a lot higher if you were actually an African-American student in the US. So troublemaker has here some positive connotations, some negative connotations. It's interesting when we look at the what I call the wonderful flavors of being a troublemaker. So you have, students who just don't like the school system, right? They're like, why do I have to show up? And I attest to that. This morning, I drove my son to start middle school at 7 o'clock. makes no sense to him or me. So, you know, he becomes a critic to the system. Is there some boredness, under-challenged? Is it tenaciously imaginative, right? They're just constantly in a space that the teacher is not in, where the schooling is not allowing them to be or not supporting. They challenge authority. They're maybe proudly individualistic. I'm doing my own thing here. They're also, you know, passive disengaging. Now, I want to make here a little bit of a disclaimer and say there is, of course, also troublemaking that comes from trauma, from situations at home, from there's context that really is really mental health issues. And I don't want to necessarily go into that space, although there's a lot to be learned about there too. But when I look at this list and take off the heading of wonderful flavors of troublemaker, it reminds me of something, and that is I'm working in STEM education. This is actually what we ask kids when we talk about STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math. That's what we tell them to be. We ask them to disrupt industries, to revolutionize new things, to think about new solutions for old problems. We question everything. It's a bit of a weird thing to ask them all that and then say, yeah, but don't touch our schooling. Let's not touch how we actually run our classrooms. No, that's not that doesn't need disruption. I need you to disrupt math, but not disrupt my classroom. It's interesting and fascinating because these characteristics we have seen, and we actually researched how teachers see good students and how teachers see STEM students. Like students are more likely to succeed in STEM. And there was not much overlap. They actually considered the good students, right? We know how we deal with that usually. The good student is an obedient and well-behaving student. We have still a lot of research that shows that teachers prefer them, right? I get it, right? You wake up in the morning and you're like, geez, Joe will run my classroom again and I have no idea what to do with him and how to incorporate him. It usually comes also with a deficiency model of education, where we look at defiance as a flaw. We're usually excluding them, right? It might be timeout, sending them home, visit to the principal's office. We try to isolate them. They're disrupting classwork. They're disrupting group work. What do? Well, we try to remove the distraction. We try to remove the defiance. There's different ways of dealing with that. So let students be heard. Active listening, where are they? Start with personal development. What is actually the goal here that we're trying to do? Seek out your students' strengths, or an asset-based educational framework. And I put here bullet points down there. You probably can come up with other things, and maybe in your practice or in how you design. I remember when I designed coursework and project work for group work. And I did that for years, decades. And I could see my rule list for group work getting longer and longer. And all of them come from, well, I had a case where somebody did that and I didn't want that. So I put a little rule in and said, you can't do that, right? And that list, of course, never ends. That list is, we find always somebody who finds a way around the system. What I'm communicating here, I guess, is let's embrace that. What is there? We could argue that defiant students, troublemakers, are actually the canary in the mine. They see when something's wrong first before anybody else sees something. And what can it tell us about our school system and our education? So a little bit of a shift. One of the most famous philosophers, Socrates, definitely got in trouble And, you know, it ended not very well for him, at least according to history, or to the stories that his student Plato wrote about him, right? He had to take, well, when he convicted of disturbing the youth, they asked him to make his own punishment. And his punishment was, I want free food and housing for my life for all the service I provide to Athens. And then they said, no, we don't do that. Here's a poisonous drink, and you just drink it and die. He asked questions that nobody asked. He not only questioned words and meanings, but systems. Like, why are we doing what we're doing? He also started from a point of proclaiming total ignorance, right? I mean, this is, you know, I don't know. I mean, most of his dialogues, and it is written in dialectic form about his philosophical process, start with, you know, you tell me something and I have no idea what you're talking. And at the end of the dialogues, most of the time, his counterparts say, I don't know what I'm talking either. There is not a truth, and in the most capital terms, but like going underneath what is there, and not teaching necessarily doctrine, what his philosophy is characterized by. And it made certainly its way into the education system. I mean, we might have all used Socratic methods, Socratic dialogue. So it is something we certainly value. There's a lot more in philosophy, and so I'm shifting a little bit to that space. We could see philosophy as a contributor to reality check of what we're doing in education. And I have seen that definitely in educational technology for a long time. And I draw here from Hegel, who is a German philosopher who built one of the first who built a unified theory of philosophy. He could explain everything. I mean, people pilgrimaged to his lectures, and he was like the god of philosophy for a while. And he built this massive system, beautiful, and told everybody we live in there. Well, one of his students who came to him came from Denmark. His name is Søren Kierkegaard. And you might know him as the father of existentialism and a very critical, skeptical school of philosophy. And he said, no, we actually live here. We don't live in your big mansion that you're building, but if I look at your life, if I look at our life, we are actually living here. And I have seen that so many times that people have developed technologies and they don't use them themselves. A good example might be mind maps. Yes, we teach with a lot of mind maps. We use a lot of mind maps in classrooms. I have to say, I use them too in classrooms. And when was the last time I used mind maps for my own work? I have a hard time going back to that. I don't find them that useful. But, it's a great tool for teaching. So philosophy and philosophical perspective of what systems are we advocating and what systems actually are we using would be an interesting way. And, if I look at where we actually live, this is the space we live in education from a certain perspective, right? We live in a space, at least in the US, where students have to take their exams in McDonald's parking lots because that's the only Wi-Fi in their area. We live in a space where fake and fact is not really that discernible anymore. We live in a space where, we constantly say our students are achieving differently and we want to close the achievement gap, and in reality, it is an opportunity gap. They never started at the same space. How would we expect them to end up at the same space? And where we have, police showing up at schools, at least this is in the US, a teacher can call actually the police and say, I have a disturbing student, and the police comes. A lot of high schools have police officers in their schooling, in their school buildings. And, we deal still with a gender inequality that, for the same work, women still make less, right? This is a reality in which we're operating. This has a huge impact on who is the teaching staff in schools, right? You have a large number of women going into a profession and the salary drops for years, for decades, for centuries. I mean, education is a good example for that. Philosophy deals with big question. How do we know what we know? What is reality? Does God exist? What is the nature of the mind? Do we have free will? Morally right and wrong? How should we organize society? These are all fundamental questions to an education system as well. And if we look at sub-disciplines of philosophy, like you have the study of the foundations of science, or what it means to know, or what constitutes reality, logic, political philosophy, down to, aesthetics, study of what is beautiful, what it means to be human, the study of morality and what is just. If we look at what philosophy can really bring to education, we could look at, for example, just as a single case, about hermeneutics, an area in philosophy that is concerned about understanding and examining the deep experience of what it means to be human. Now, I see a lot of programs in education where what I would call demographic segmentation, right? Maybe you're still learning, using learning styles. I mean, it's kind of completely out in a bit. So I don't want to go necessarily there, but, we tend to classify people, right? And then offer differentiated education for all the different buckets we place students first in. So might it be, in research on gender, occupation, educational level, income, ethnicity, family size. That's one way of seeing the world. And when we design education, I think we all have some level of groupings in our mind. Now, what we usually have is this picture. And some of these groupings might appear there and are very visible, and most all of them are not. And what makes them unique is unique. There are unique experiences and unique individuals, and yes, they share experiences. So how do we see our students for whom we design or teach? This has, of course, huge implications, like a student is not a student is not a student, right? There are individual, and the whole move towards individualized and personalized learning goes certainly in that direction. What makes one student successful might not help another. The image of a student is shaped how we experience them. My dad, he was a teacher. His main lesson was always, if I think that students are dumb, some students are dumb, I have a model in my mind about where I classify people in dumb and smart. And the only thing the kids do is move from one of my categories to another one of my categories. Getting rid of the notion that they're dumb and smart kids helped him become a better teacher. Here's another example of philosophical contributions to education. So we have the field of epistemology or epistemological beliefs. What do we believe on how we know, right? How do you know? This is one model. It's a multi-stage model on epistemological development stages. There has been a lot of research in college that students tend to start in a dualistic objectivist stage. So knowledge is certain, and they're looking for expert and authorities. They're actually getting quite angry when they walk out of a lecture, a classroom interaction, and they feel like the instructor didn't give them the truth. It's out there, so why does he or she not give it to? It's of course an interesting, this model of dualism cracks when students encounter then a separate figure of authority saying something differently. Then it starts cracking, and interestingly enough, we might find, and there has been tons of research done by Schommer and Ben Dixon, Schraw, that show actually students move maybe one stage in their 4 years of undergraduate schooling, maybe a little bit more, but this is not a lot of move. It's a long process to get out of a dualistic to a multiplist, like, okay, I acknowledge some knowledge might be not as certain, right? When you go to a relativistic one, which is very funny because it's like, you know, everything goes, who knows? I don't know, and you don't know, and we all don't know. And then the committed relativistic position is this notion as, well, it might be true, but I need to know the boundaries, the context. It depends, right? It depends, the famous answer that no students wants to hear. And they see themselves as increasingly as a source of knowledge that needs to be justified, right? That you can just stand by yourself. You need to say, where is it coming from, what I'm actually doing and what I'm actually thinking. Where do our students fall? It's interesting because I introduced that as a classification system, and so I'm violating my previous slide, right? I'm putting now students into buckets of dualists versus multiplists. So in our work, we're not, you know, we're not restricted to contradict ourselves. And this is okay if I'm aware of it, hopefully. Most of the time I'm not. It's an interesting question for education or instructional system design. How are we presenting material? Are we presenting stuff as an absolute truth? Is that stuff just to be learned? That's just how it is? Could we focus more on the process of knowing instead of exclusively facts of what to know? Helping students move into different stages is a learning outcome by itself. It's often times seen as a byproduct of our educational system. It is a core element of making students more aware where they are and challenging a frame in which they're operating, not necessarily their specific thinking, concepts, understanding they have, but a frame in which they operate on how they think they know what they know. So that requires, of course, environments where we ask students to actually challenge. And oftentimes the challenging existing knowledge, right? When it's there, we might assign to that and say, that's great, that's critical thinking, we like that. If I replace existing knowledge so they have to challenge me, my instruction, how I teach, what I teach, then it's getting a little bit less comfortable. We tend not to see that necessarily that valuable when they come at us. We want them to challenge, you know, Newton. We don't necessarily want to challenge my classroom. So there is a bit of an interesting dynamic going on, and something that students, again, with the troublemakers, we confuse them. You're allowed to do this. You should be critically thinking. And again, my space in which you are invited to critically think is untouchable. Ontology or ontological beliefs. So the notion of, do we actually know what reality is and what is actually reality? And these are all different flavors on a spectrum from, you know, there is a clear reality, right? There is something to be known and I just have to find the right measurement, but I will get to patterns. The world is made out of patterns, physical laws, whatever you take it. And then, you know, if you go to idealism or Berkeley's philosophical position, where it's like, you know, the stuff is in your head. There's nothing that constitutes reality, which is an interesting position. I think he still collected his paycheck and his retirement funding. So there's a little bit inconsistency in his own thinking, because if everything's just in your mind, then, you know, your employer could also say, your employment contract was a bit in your mind, so we don't have to really deal with the physical realities of giving you a check. But where do we fall and where do our students fall in this large spectrum of what are we actually trying to teach them? What are we actually thinking is underneath and looking at what we're actually teaching? So you have, implications again, as oftentimes if we present truths to be simple, our students tend to be looking for simple solutions, right? And they experience then the world in patterns that we describe, and the patterns, because they are oversimplified, lend themselves to think that this is actually the world. Sometimes we have scaffolds to help students understand by simplifying things. And it's as important to take these scaffolds away and say, wait a second, the world is still way too complex that my scaffolds could really touch on the core of what we're actually doing here. There are many things outside the realm of facts. I mean, I know I'm a scientist, many maybe here are. It's hard to acknowledge that. It's hard to acknowledge, I mean, if we are talking about philosophy and the big questions, do I think there is a God? I don't know. And there's, of course, multiple schools and thoughts in it, but I find it dishonest to rule that out. It's very hard to disprove, right? I'm not saying it's proven, but it's also hard to disprove. And are we acknowledging that there are things out there in the world that are just really hard to understand? And that could be in the spiritual space, that could be in the mystical space, that could be in intuition, that could be in psychic abilities, right? You can all test all variety of different things, but it comes down to the content we teach and the work we're doing as well. Like if a student asks a question and I don't know, it's a good answer when there is not really clarity in that. And not necessarily thinking I could ever produce a clarity to be just able to teach. I mean, otherwise, why do we do still science? It has been a long time around. We should know stuff by now, right? Are we encouraging students to reflect and challenge the reality we expose them to? That's a tough one. Because you take certain things for granted, not about just how you know them, but you take certain things for granted and we build our education around that. And are they allowed to say, I don't take that for granted. This really shifted. I don't experience it as such. We oftentimes talk about different functions of education, and this is certainly where educational philosophy, which is its own arm of philosophy and has its own flavors. And I don't want to go here into educational philosophy. It has its own, behaviorism, constructivism, all of cognitivism, and huge elements and huge contributions by people like Brunner and Dewey and Spinoza and stuff. I don't want to go there because that's an easy way to go when we talk about philosophy and education. We go into the one that is already educationally oriented. But I want to bring up this, these roles of what education actually is, because it was really eye-opening for me to think about, particularly when you work in STEM education like I do, right? You find yourself constantly in that space. This is where people see STEM education. This is where people see education in an increasing, rapid way. I find that concerning, actually, that the value of education is asked mostly, does it help me get employment? Does it help me get a good job? Does it help me get money? There are other elements to education, and the one is personal development, learning about yourself, or socialization. What does it mean to be a productive, co-constructive member of society? I would argue that this part requires to be a troublemaker too, but are we considering all these elements in when we do education, that this is actually constantly present? And which one are we overemphasizing, underemphasizing, will have a large impact on how our students see the education system by itself. So what roles and functions are we designing or developing learning systems for? Are we actually discussing different roles? Are we saying, you know, maybe this is a part where that's not employability at all. It's about, you know, being a good citizen, being a functioning member of society, or this is about you learning something about yourself or others that you encounter. This is not about just getting a job and being paid. I'm specifically talking now about epistemic beliefs, and these are like beliefs what a profession is. And I bring here, this is hard to do in a more abstract way. So I bring here in my field of engineering education, we often talk about the 4 dimensions of engineering, right? There is an engineer as a humanist, engineer, scientist, crafts worker, and designer. And when you look at any curriculum programs in this field of engineering, you find it rather skewed to one or the other side. So how do we present engineering is here the broader question, but really, how do we present professions, right? When we prepare students for being in a profession, what do we tell them what that means? Are we allowing them, preparing them to be multiple identities behind that, right? If I'm a nurse, then there is identities of public service, of care, of, you know, you can probably find many others. Anything we teach students to prepare them for professions have multiple identities attached to them. Are we encouraging them to actually design their own identity? I remember in educational technology, that was another eye-opening thing when I entered the field of educational technology and then realized there's a huge spectrum. I could be a hardcore programmer of learning software, and I can be a learning scientist who understands how people learn. And everything in between, for media development, instructional, more focused on instructional design, less focused on media development. You know, I was actually encouraged in my field, in my study, to identify and build identity around what it actually means for me to be an educational technologist. How are we preparing them for the ever-changing world, right? That there might be identities coming that they haven't considered necessarily yet. There's the field of aesthetics, and I think we do a lot in the terms of usability. We do some in the forms of creativity, innovation. There is stuff, so here's a little homage to Montreal. There is something about beauty and elegance. Are we fostering the creative, artistic side of students? You can do that in any project, in any subject area. Are we considering beauty, elegance, right? We consider usability. We consider, is it functional? Is it actually the user experience, the learner experience? We consider that quite a bit, but is there something about elegance and color theory, which also have been done? I'm just saying this is a reflective element that philosophy really can produce, and we can look into that of aesthetic theories that are existing that go beyond our current aesthetical sense. Something, you know, this has all to do with like what we teach and who our students are and how content is operating. There's also a very practical part where philosophy can play a huge role. So if I would ask you, how many parts does a learning system have? The answer is, of course, it really depends, right? I mean, this is, it depends how you define a part, right? And I think in learning object work, we have struggled for that for decades now. What is the most granular? Is that now usable? Because if I don't have it granular and there's context attached to object, then I can't really reuse it. It has like, you know, then we're just dealing with objects that floating around. it has a huge impact on how we process, design, update, storage, assemble learning environments, right? It has, if we would crack that nut of what is a reusable learning object, we could easier assemble instructional elements, for example. Well, there is a field in philosophy, a subdiscipline called merology. And it is the subdiscipline concerned with the relationship between the whole and the parts. What is a whole and what is it made up of? And just a quick story, when Boeing restructured their aircraft storage system, so where they assembled aircrafts, and we're talking millions of parts, 7 million parts go into a Boeing machine, Boeing aircraft. They face the problem that they have half assembled pieces and loose screws, right? And then, but part of the half assembled is of course a bunch of screws and other things that they also have in singles. So they actually run into the complexity question, how do we keep a proper inventory? Because we want to know how many screws we have, but we also want to know, are the screws in certain subsystems already used, and how many subsystems do we have? So they actually couldn't crack that. So they actually invited a philosopher to. So Boeing's aircraft 7 million piece storage system was actually developed by a philosopher who worked with them on ontologies of storage of their pieces. So this is just a little tidbit, and but this brings me actually to the end. And I hope this sparked some interest, or you had any, it maybe sparked some self-reflection, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are, but you have here also my email address where you can certainly ask me any questions. I stop sharing now.
Thank you very, very much, Johannes. Let's give you a virtual round of applause for that. We've got about 8 minutes for questions, and I hope that people have them. Anybody want to start with a question? Clark made a comment that I think maybe you might want to address. Clark Quinn said, yeah, you should talk to librarians as well. Any thoughts about that one?
Yeah, there's, I mean, you have with librarians, you have multiple, you have, first of all, the Dewey Decimal System, which is running on its last seams of explosion in a world that doesn't really necessarily fit anymore. On the other hand, you also have they dealing with an informal side of learning in a massive amount of way. They're sitting, they're providing feedback, they have a lot of times online office hours. Like understanding where people coming from is a huge part of their work life. And there's many things very applicable in that space to their work.
Anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? We've had a pretty deep subject. I can't imagine. I mean, we have a couple hand raised. Carol and then Diane. Carol first.
There we go. Thank you so much. Your presentation is like a breath of fresh air. Yeah, as soon as you think you're stuck in a box, you've broken up all the boxes and created new boxes. I love it. If you were to give, I'm an instructional designer for Thompson Rivers University. If you were to, I'm trying to come out with a synthesis message to bring back to my colleagues. Is there one that you would give? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Thank you for that. I probably would go back and mention the systems we build. They serve purposes, and these purposes are intended or unintended. And it's a really good thing sometimes to just step out and look at your own work processes, but also what you're producing, and saying, can we take a different lens and look at that? And what would that actually tell us, right? Like And it's hard. Sometimes we hire consultants to do that, right? They come just in to look at it from an outside perspective. But like saying, what is our hidden curriculum in there? What are assumptions we have about learners, faculty? And some of these assumptions might have been deep-rooted, right? I mean, I have them. I encounter them every day where I'm like, yeah, I think actually that holds true. And when I challenge it, things shift or can shift, or I'm pretty resistant. I don't want it to shift, and then it bites me back eventually. So these, I would bring that back, like stepping out and looking at it from very different perspectives that we might not take usually.
Diane, and then Angela.
Sorry, thank you.
Good morning, and I thank you very much for your talk. I'm curious about the idea of internalization of career, and you speak to and you use the example of engineers. I'm an educational developer, so I work with faculty on their own sort of self-actualization as they move through discipline-specific knowledge to teacher. And I've come across this a number of times where faculty continue even after a 20 or 30-year career as an educator. They see themselves as an engineer, or they see themselves as a dentist, or they see themselves as a historian. And they have never made that transition to thinking about themselves as an educator of those things, but see themselves only as the thing. And I'm curious, in terms of your work, where one can turn that on or make that transition, or understand that at some point in your career as an educator, you need to think of yourself perhaps as an educator who teaches this discipline, as opposed to somebody who works in the discipline if you haven't been in the discipline for 20 or 30 years. So I'm curious about how philosophy could help with that.
Yeah, it's tricky because a lot of times, particularly when I work with engineers, and it seems like a very similar experience that you had, it is often that their teaching is following a model that they have experienced before as their own when they were students. Yet also their identity is oftentimes made up of their technical work. And this is a hard nut to crack, but because it's what is their role, right? And some of them think that being a good engineer makes them automatically a good teacher. So they definitely see the range of identity. They just see one aspect is certainly helpful to the other, when it's, of course, having subject matter knowledge is important for being an engineering faculty, but the notion of pedagogical content knowledge and other elements of that is then oftentimes not necessarily seen. I'm going back to cognitive dissonance. I mean, can you throw them into a situation where somebody teaches them something that they never heard before, and it's bad teaching, and let them reflect on, seems like a really good expert, why was it not able to come across? Student voices are helpful there, right? When students say, I have really interest in a subject, but I'm not getting it. And what way are we presenting it to back? So, but it's tough to start reflection in people who might not reflect. That's.
Well, and I find as well, if I could just follow up for a moment, I find as well that that once they have that aha moment, their ability to teach and their comfort with their discipline just sort of levels out and becomes more balanced. Whereas they may have spent a long time in their career feeling that sort of tug of frustration because they're not sure how to teach what they need to teach. So they feel the frustration because they know how critical they know in themselves how critical this knowledge is for their learners, but they haven't learned how yet to think about it in terms of the learner's pedagogical understanding, rather than the fact that they learned a particular way as an engineer, for example.
Well, and that would be like if you take an asset-based, not a deficiency model on there, then you could say, look, when you do your engineering work, you would never do what you do in your classroom. You would never use old instrumentation to come up with new solutions and sell it as the best innovation by relying on other things that you have developed 10 years ago. Or, you know, so do they see themselves actually as engineers in their classroom, the engineers of their classroom? Yeah. There might be, you know, where you say, this is not much different. What's the need? What's the problem? Let's design and let's measure if it was successful. I mean, that's engineering practices, and they know that very well.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. I that is a model I use, so I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Angela has the last question.
Oh, sorry. Okay, good. Hi, Johannes. So this whole idea of disruption, I absolutely love. And in the K-12 space, which is not my space, but in my grad courses, I get people coming out of a teacher education program. And even though they have courses like classroom management, I think it's more let's buffer you down versus actually let you be individualistic and see how you are. And so I'm wondering, like, what would it take, Johannes, to somehow embrace the disruption that really makes things much more interesting in general? So, you know, like I created a grad course called Myths, Legends, and Lies, because what I was hearing from learners who were coming up into my grad class were like, who the heck told you that? Like, who told you that was true, sort of thing. And in regard to myths, I just want to give a shout out to Clark Quinn, who's here, who did a great book all about myths of learning, myths in education, and just myths in general. So what do you think about what do we do? Like, how do we shift that? I find also that my learners need permission to be disruptive. It's crazy.
I mean, it's a complex question. I mean, we are working right now on a project where we use attribution theory. So, you know, there is a lot of notion of we see a kid fail and we think it's the kid's fault. And when the kids succeed, then I was a good teacher. And so can we shift that there is innate elements, and not innate in terms of not changing, but there are elements within kids that let them succeed. And can we shift the notion of when they fail, it's actually more of a system failure on them, instead of them failing in a great system. The interesting part is teachers see that themselves as well. We have tons of research here in the US that shows 95% of elementary teachers are not stressed. They're extremely stressed about their situation in their classrooms. Elementary, these kids are still in a pleasing phase. This is, you know, I mean, we're talking about how can we really reduce the stress level for everybody in the system? This is not about teachers versus students and students versus teachers, right? So the shift has to be, you know, do we need to hit pause on excessive assessment? Do we hit pause on you know, my kids? I have two young sons, right? From about March till May, they don't do anything besides test taking as a prep for the real test, and then the real test. Right? That's what they do. That's what the entire school is focusing on. Can we, you know, there's many different systemic things that we could disrupt around that would allow then more space for that to happen. We need to empower people. I mean, this is the tricky part, right? Education is not seen as a profession in the US, at least. It's a makeshift profession when you didn't do something else, at least in many people's minds. They, you know, I can do it too. So if they're not seen as professionals, do we give them not the space to be professional?
I hate to interrupt it, but we are at 1 o'clock. It's always I mean, in a way it's good when the conversation gets really good, we have to unfortunately end it, but people are in the middle of the workday. But I really want to thank Johannes for an outstanding presentation. And I want to thank the audience for like some great questions. Angela, for your job, your work that you did to bring Johannes here in the first place, because the initial invitations came from her. And I just want to thank you on a personal level for probably the best explanation of philosophy, at least I've ever had. So I was copiously taking notes. So thank you, everyone. There will be a recording. We will share with you when the recording is up. It usually takes about a week or two to make happen because it's done by volunteers. So just be a little patient, but they will be there. Anyway, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you for your,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Thanks for the questions.
Well done. Thanks, everybody.